man about to board the twin-masted whaler at South Fremantle Dock stared long and hard at the quayside buildings, the expressionless look on his weather-beaten face seemingly set in stone. He gazed for several moments without seeing anything before mounting the gangplank and stepping onto the main deck with an air of grave solemnity. The grimness of his bearing marked him apart from the other sailors boarding the ship, lively men now laughing and joking among themselves as they clambered aboard. The stern-faced silent man went below and stowed his dunnage in the foremost crew cabin, taking careful note of the interior fixtures and fittings before making his way to the afterdeck to sit alone, his dark ringed eyes staring towards the harbour exit. The reason for his sombre mood would have been impossible to explain to his fellow shipmates, for they would never believe his amazing story. No one would. He himself was at a loss to understand why he should suddenly be chosen to bear this dark and terrible secret, a secret revealed to him in a dreadful vision just a few nights before. The ship's name, proudly displayed on a plaque across the stern just beneath where the solitary figure now sat, was the Cervantes, and he alone knew that she was destined to sink not more than 24 hours sailing north up the coast on this, her very last voyage. The entire incident of what was about to happen had been revealed to him in a terrifying vision, heralded by a pirate ghost calling itself the Keeper. The phantom had appeared from out of the darkness of the bedroom at the Fremantle Inn, suddenly materializing at the foot of the bed, along with the strong smell of seaweed carried on the sharp tang of salty sea air. The Keeper ghost stood silent and watchful as the startled man struggled bravely to contain his rising panic, but the faraway look in the dead grey eyes bespoke no malice, and for some strange but absolute certainty it was clear the ghost meant him no harm. While there was no actual movement of air in the darkened room, the semi-transparent clothes of the ghost swayed and fluttered as though in a restless sea breeze. He wore a tattered buccaneer hat that sat atop an unruly mop of long, straggly hair, the end strands of which lifted to flicker and dance on the invisible wind. There had been a distant sound of thunder as the ghost made to speak, a fearful sound of crashing waves against the bow of failing stays of a doomed ship, and the unmistakable death-throat shriek of powerful winds furiously tearing at the sails and rigging. Impossible that such phantom wind should bounce from the walls of the Fremantle Inn bedroom, but it was happening, and it was as real as any experience the sailor had known throughout his many years of seafaring. The voice that came from the pirate ghost, something beyond a watery grave, was low and gravelly, sending chills up the sailor's spine, as the thin, greenish-white face of the apparition trembled with the unaccustomed effort of speech. "I am the keeper of the Cervantes treasure, and hereby summon you, Isaiah Milliken, to take charge of a precious cargo." The ghost paused for a moment, the liquid eyes boring into the terrified sailor, staring helplessly back from his bed. The hypnotic eyes became churning whirlpools, drawing the man down into unfathomable depths. "You must sign on to the whaling ship Cervantes first thing in the morning, for she is doomed to sink a short distance up the coast. Be not afraid, all will survive the sinking of the ship, most especially you and your charge." As he spoke, a misty vision came into view on the wall behind the apparition. The misty vaporous scene gradually swirled into focus, revealing the ship Cervantes being tossed and swamped in heavy seas just a few hundred metres off the West Australian coastline. It was a vision of the immediate future, and there was no doubting that the events unfolding before his staring eyes were truly about to happen. The pirate ghost continued. In the foremost crew cabin, hidden against the dark deck planking against the forward bulkhead, you will find a treasure chest. It is small and light enough for you alone to carry, and mark me well, Isaiah, for it is you alone must perform this task. None of the other crew members must know of your mission, not a living soul. The ghost raised a skeletal thin bone of a finger in emphasis as the terrified Isaiah struggled to find his voice, and when it came, hoarse and trembling, the effort to actually speak to this phantom was enormous, but he managed. Why me? I've just come ashore from a long and perilous voyage all the way from South America. I don't want this dangerous job you offer me. I need some rest. The pirate ghost ignored the feeble protestation. Its look stern and uncompromising. It is your destiny, Isaiah. There is no one else. You must carry the chest ashore and bury it in a secret spot. You will be shown exactly where at the time. Don't worry, you will come to no harm. The ship will founder in shallow waters. This failed to reassure the terrified sailor, who once again protested being summoned for such a bizarre and dangerous mission. Before he could say more, the ghost held up a hand and leaned forward menacingly. It spoke again, with an icy phantom wind carrying the words from bloodless grey lips. You have no choice. It is ordained that you do as I say. You will save and hide the Cervantes treasure. And with that, the apparition of the pirate ghost began to fade. One last call coming from some far and distant place, another dimension somewhere beyond the grave. It is written in the stars, you will save the Cervantes treasure, you and you alone, came the fading call, then nothing. The bedroom suddenly back to normal and empty, save for his own presence and the strong smell of seaweed and salty sea air. Oh yes, it had been real enough, and he knew that he had no choice in the matter. It somehow seemed to him that he had always known, almost like something he had dreamed as a boy to forget about until this very moment. He realized there and then that it was true. He had no choice but to follow this thing through to whatever end. And here he was, having not slept a wink for the rest of the night. He knew, as the very first rays of sunlight came filtering through the curtain window, that this was something he could not walk away from. By the dawn's first light, he had found the whaling ship Cervantes at the Fremantle wharf and reluctantly signed on with the officer of the watch for this fateful journey. Leaving the safe harbour of Fremantle, the Indian Ocean looked for all the wide world like a vast sheet of rippling blue satin studded with flashing diamonds of sunlight. Rottnest Island slid slowly by to their port as the good ship and crew made fair progress sailing due north past the gleaming beaches of Perth. The weather held fine as the sun dipped low towards the horizon, slowly changing the ocean surface from sapphire blue into a sheet of gleaming bronze. A scattered handful of mid-level clouds took fire in the sky from the setting sun, the wiry bodies of the crew members working the last jobs on deck in the gathering dusk, taking on the deep colours of the sunset. Throughout the night she sailed smoothly and easily, with a moderate southerly wind assisting her northward passage. Isaiah had drawn the early wheel watch and found the ship as easy to keep on course in such a placid sea. But his thoughts were in turmoil, and he spoke little to those who came and went through the wheelhouse. Bright moonlight glistened on the water to create a liquid silver highway leading away to the darkened horizon. But his troubled thoughts were far away while the ship rode easily on through the night. After turning into his cabin around midnight, sleep stubbornly refused to ease apprehension. The terrifying vision the pirate ghost had shown him haunting his every waking movement. As the morning sun began to lighten the sky, Isaiah once again sat silent and alone at the stern rail, now avoided by the rest of the crew, resentful of his withdrawn and unsociable manner. He stared out at scanned the sea, searching for the first signs of a change in the weather. And as the ship drew close to Wedge Island, away off to the starboard, the first purple-grey clouds began to take form and gather from out of the north. Slowly at first the horizon sky darkened and clouded over, until within the hour whitecaps began to tug at the ocean surface as the wind began to gust and swirl, like tossing a restless fever. By the time the shanty town of Grey had slid behind their starboard quarter, the going was heavier still, the first drops of rain hitting the wheelhouse windows and foredeck in large fat splashes sounding like so many buckets of stones being violently hurled against the ship. The raindrops quickly welded together to wetly sheen the bucking ship in a matter of seconds. Soon to follow was the rising swell, quickly growing weightier and increasingly agitating as the now labouring vessel continued her northward course. When the Pinnacle's desert eventually came into sight through the worsting squalls, the whaling ship Cervantes was in a desperate struggle for survival. The running sea had become mountainous, the ship being tossed and swamped from stem to stern by the giant waves, utterly powerless against the immeasurable might of the ocean's fury. And soon she began to break apart. At the onset of the first heavy swell, Isaiah had ducked below to his cabin and began working furiously to pry loose the deck planking beside the forward bulkhead. The violent lurching of the ship made his task increasingly difficult, but he knew there was little time, and that on no account must he fail. The doomed ship would be breaking up and going under at any moment, and he needed to break loose the planking and pry free whatever lay hidden behind. Small unsecured items began to bounce and roll about the cabin deck as though being tossed by unseen mischievous hands. But Isaiah paid them no heed as he worked desperately at freeing up the stay, his now profusely sweating face a study in desperation. At last the plank gave way with a creaking snap and splintering of old wood, the jagged shards of which he promptly tossed aside, whereupon he immediately discovered a skillfully concealed compartment with something hidden in a mould-encrusted sack. He knew instinctively what it was and stared hard at the object as the ship took another huge crashing wave full on the beam and shuddered mightily under the impact. Seawater poured down the stairwell to drench the cabin and swamp the frantic sailor, almost tearing the chest from his grasp. But at last he had the precious cargo free from its hiding place. At once he took off his thick leather belt and, looping it through the chest lock latching, he strapped it across his shoulder and made for the upper deck, up to the dark and clouded sky, and to escape. As he braced himself at the accommodation doorway leading onto the main deck, the ship lurched and slid sideways into a deep green valley in the raging sea, the weird light filtering down through the boiling storm clouds, making the scene nightmarish. Occasional snatches of panicked shouts and cries from his shipmates. He saw one man hanging tightly to the forward mast. There 1 second, and after another foaming avalanche of seawater washed away, he was gone. Looking up, he saw a mass of storm clouds boiling overhead, swaying crazily across the sky over the tops of the mastheads. The howling wind whipped sea spray high into the air, but this was hidden from sight as the ship hurtled down into the churning trough to suddenly lift again, head-on into another giant wave, and breach the surface like a dying whale. The ship had taken on all the characteristics of a wild beast being forced into the slavering jaws of a voracious predator, and gone violently insane with panic, to be bucking, yawing, slewing in dogged resistance, stubbornly fighting death to the last. She crashed into another rising wall of water, abruptly arresting further forward movement and shuddering pitifully with the impact. Isaiah suddenly knew it was time to abandon the doomed ship, and it plummeted back down into another dark, yawning valley. He let go his grip on the doorframe. All at once he was in a bubbling dark green cauldron of sea, and confused as to which direction to try for in the hope of making land. He allowed the surging current to sweep him away from the now quickly rising ship, and repeatedly drew gasping breaths each time he broke the surface. Within an instant, he caught sight of a shadowy greenish glow hovering over a sandy beach several hundred metres off to his right. He caught repeat glimpses of the extraordinary light through the driving rain and flying sea spume, and made to swim sideways toward it. The going seemed terribly slow, but on he struggled until he felt the last of his strength beginning to desert him. At last, thoroughly exhausted, he closed his eyes and went under, only to discover the water was now shallow enough for his feet to touch the bottom with his toes. The feel of the wet sandy bottom came as an immense relief as he struck out hard for land and safety with all the remaining energy he could muster. The eerie light gleaming through the rain guided him through the rough waters like a beacon, and soon he found himself only knee-deep without so much as a scratch after coming through such a perilous ordeal. The weight of the treasure chest on his shoulder became heavier as soon as he emerged from the waves and staggered up the short stretch of white sand to collapse, expended but relieved in the tufted dunes. He rested but for a moment when his attention was once again caught by the ghostly light shining weakly through the rain, calling him on like an irresistible siren. All at once the light grew brighter to then transform into the grisly apparition of the pirate ghost once again. The unworldly phantom hovered over the spot where it indicated the treasure must be buried, and bid Isaiah to get to work, hiding the chest without delay. Other crew members washed ashore as the ship finally broke apart, the gallant vessel now completely abandoned and finally surrendering to the fury of the sea. One by one, the men staggered out from the waves and turned to watch the ship in her final moments. The saddest and most heart-wrenching sight for men of the sea to behold. No one spoke a word. 100 metres inland from where the ship's survivors were gathered, at the beach, the pirate ghost urged a hurried conclusion to his mission. "Dig deep into the sand here, Isaiah, and make haste that no one takes note of your activity." Although dreadfully tired and cold, Isaiah set to the work without complaint. Finding an unexpected energy, he managed to dig a decent-sized hole with his bare hands alone, the soaking wet sand coming out and stacking on the side surprisingly easily. The rain was already easing up slightly, but would carry on for long enough to wash down any telltale sign or indication of his handiwork, and soon the treasure chest was safely in the hole and covered up with the wet sand. A sudden squall of rain soaked it down to obliterate the last of the surface marks, and in that instant the pirate ghost made ready to go. "You have performed your duty well, Isaiah. Your reward will come in good time. But be warned, you must never reveal the hiding place of this chest to a living soul. For if you do, the very fires of hell will break loose upon the land in a most terrible war." The now fading ghost looked hard at the kneeling Isaiah, his glistening eyes burning into the sailor's soul as though to reinforce the words just uttered with frightening finality. And with those last words of warning, the phantom ghost faded away into the slanting grey rain, just as the first break in the clouds could be seen far out to sea. Isaiah wandered back down to stand among the exhausted men at the water's edge, the captain very much relieved to see that everyone had survived the shipwreck when the last man appeared from the sand dunes. No one thought to ask where he'd been or what he'd been up to, their minds and bodies numbed by the strain and trauma of the surviving the shipwreck. The secret of the treasure now secure and locked away in his silence as he followed the gazes of the men looking out to sea. The first bright shaft of sunlight struck cleanly through the heart of the tempest to glitter like a dancing ribbon of gold along the ocean's horizon, and at once the killer storm began to die. As the weather gradually began to subside, the men gathered to themselves and set about hunting along the shoreline for any useful debris washed ashore from the wreck. They desperately needed fresh water, and as luck would have it, several undamaged barrels were soon easily retrievable from the shallows. The afternoon saw a coordinated salvage operation involving all hands, and by the time the sun was sinking down to the now calmed ocean, they had gathered enough supplies to see them through the drawn-out journey back down to Fremantle along the coast on foot. A long and perilous excursion, but their only hope. A small group of stranded seafarers stood at the water's edge as the sun dipped into the ocean horizon. The fury of the storm long since evaporated, along with a heavy cloud to be replaced by a pronounced stillness. They watched the majestic sunset fire the sky in total silence, as though in marked respect of the graceful ship they had witnessed die that very afternoon. Isaiah made a silent vow that he would keep his word about not telling anyone of the hidden treasure chest. But his silence alone was not to keep the secret completely secure, and the terrible war the pirate ghost had forewarned would surely follow. It was many years later that the small fishing village town at this location came into being and was aptly named Cervantes after the shipwreck. The seafaring community began to grow and prosper until the first suspicion was aroused at the Cervantes Ronsard Bay Tavern. It came following dark rumours concerning the new man who'd been working at the bar for the past few weeks. He had arrived suddenly from the north, a circumstance that lent itself to distrust, since the murderous Dynamite Bay pirates were just a short distance north of the coast. A state of war had existed between this band of thieving cutthroats and the more peace-loving pirates of Cervantes for many years, although had thus far been contained to occasional brief skirmishes between ships at sea, since both camps were evenly matched in the skills of war. While the Dynamite Bay Corsair raiders, frigates and men-of-war ships outclassed the smaller but more manoeuvrable and therefore equally deadly Cervantes fleet, the outcome of any all-out conflict was unpredictable, so both sides wisely avoided a potential bloodbath and sensibly steered clear of each other. This uncertain truce now fell beneath a very threatening shadow, with the arrival of the skinny stranger with darting rat's eyes and nosy questions. He had been staying at the Traveller's Inn, where he also worked part-time as a cleaner, and it was here his furtive activities aroused suspicion and alarm when he was caught red-handed going through someone else's belongings. The feeble excuse that he had dropped something of value, a silver ring he claimed, while cleaning the room was dismissed as a plainly transparent lie, but was pretended to be accepted so that more could be learned about the shady character. The Cervantes pirates were gathered at the bar that night when landlord McAvoy called their attention, a serious expression of concern clouding his normal cheerful smile. At length, an expectant silence finally stilled all casual chatter. He spoke. "I believe we have a spy among us." His solemn words hung heavy in the smoky air, the faces of the group at the bar suddenly frozen into angry disbelief. They all then spoke at once in an excited babble, but McAvoy held up his hand and commanded silence before going on. The new man, Kurt, I've been watching him for a while now after Hamish saw him snooping through his personal belongings at the inn. Well, yesterday my suspicions were confirmed when this letter fell out of his pocket while he was shifting beer barrels. He produced 2 dirty-looking pieces of paper covered in a thin, spidery scrawl and held them up for all to see. The only reason I got to look at them was because they had fallen into a puddle of beer and needed to be dried out if they were to be of any use. So I opened the letter in order to save it. Well, it's a good job I did, because this snake in the grass is spying on us for the Dynamite Bay pirates. This last exclamation was greeted with an explosion of curses amid threats of what should happen to the deceitful spy. But again, McAvoy demanded the attention of the group by holding up his hand. "It's no good us just stringing him up. as we won't learn anything about what he's up to. We need to know why they sent him here and what they're after, so whatever punishment will have to wait, no matter how deserving." "How do you propose to learn anything from a cunning spy?" demanded one of the men, his chin thrust forward aggressively. "Do we torture him or what?" "No, I think our best bet is to let him carry on thinking he's got us all fooled, and maybe get him in a good and drunk before trying to get his information from the swine." This notion was greeted with thoughtful nodding of heads and murmurs of agreement. Another pirate waded into the conversation. "If this is the way we do it, then we must be careful not to let him realise we're onto him. In other words, we pretend we're mates and carry on as if nothing's happened." For some, that might not be so easy. The man who spoke then looked at Corey, who had a murderous expression on his face and was keener than the rest to see instant justice dished out to the spy. The others followed the look and waited, the silence growing heavier by the second. "All right," Corey muttered. "We'll wait, but he's for it when we find out what he's up to." The men agreed, discussing how they might keep Kurt the spy in the dark until such times as they could find out what they needed to know. McAvoy then read to them the damning contents of the letter, its treacherous substance sealing the fate of the spy once and for all. Evidently the Dynamite Bay pirates had somehow come into possession of an ancient treasure map indicating the presence of buried riches, although it didn't say exactly what, in the region of Cervantes' Thirsty Point. Evidently the map was so old and decayed so as to be almost unreadable, but the man who now had it in his possession, the murderous, cutthroat Bloodbeard, was clearly convinced there was something to it. The spy had been sent to learn as much as he could about Cervantes' defences, so as to prepare Bloodbeard and his pirates for a surprise attack on the town. Clearly, Cervantes was in great danger, and there was no time to lose. As the evening wore on, several couples drifted into the tavern and were once advised of the situation and sworn to secrecy. The gathering at the bar now consisted of some 15 people when the door swung open to reveal the very topic of debate, the spy, Kurt. A moment of heavy silence prevailed as the group all turned to stare at the suspected spy, and at once his eyes narrowed in alarm at the hostile reception. McAvoy was quick to rectify the situation and called out with enforced cheerfulness for Kurt to come on in and close the door. The group quickly adopted the ploy and with feigned goodwill heartily joined in the welcome. One of the pirate wenches, Kylie, moved away from the bar and sidled up to Kurt as he walked slowly into the centre of the room. She flicked back her hair and took his arm with a lazy smile widening her glossy lips. "Don't be such a stranger, Kurt. You can buy a lady a drink if you like." The invitation redolent with the promise of warmer friendship if Kurt played his cards right, and the watchful yet hooded eyes of the pirate group noticed the tension immediately drain away from the man as he excitedly contemplated this unexpected good fortune. 2 more wenches joined in the flirting with wide-mouthed smiles and brightly flashing eyes. Kurt was in his glory while the drinks seemed to be coming from everywhere. The initial caution faded in tandem with the steady influx of strong drink, until with a shock he suddenly realised the situation was getting out of control. He was more than just a little drunk, and this could spell disaster for one in such a perilous situation. He squinted hard at Kylie, who seemed perfectly relaxed and at ease, and his booze-befuddled brain no longer capable of forming any quick plan of action. In spite of this, he knew he could be getting into greater danger if he continued to drink with such abandon, and so, lurching away from the bar, he stumbled heavily against 2 of the girls before excusing himself and weaving over to the toilets. Without a word, 2 of the men quietly followed the spy and stood guard outside the door while another small group slipped outside the tavern to monitor any potential escape out of the toilet window. They were taking no chances with this one. A small group of men filed silently out of the front door and made haste around the back of the tavern, the moonlight casting fleeting grey shadows in the surrounding bushes as they moved swiftly through the night. Not a word was spoken while they grouped beneath the toilet window and then stood a couple of paces back to melt into the dark shadows cast by the beaming moon. Inside the tavern toilet, Kurt the spy was being violently sick, the noisy heaving and retching caused as much by naked fear as it was by the foolish excess of alcohol.